Picture your grandmother setting the table for dinner. She saves the bread crusts, she turns off every light in every empty room. She reuses the same plastic bag until it falls apart. And when you leave food on your plate, there's that look. Not angry exactly, but something older than anger. Something that doesn't quite have a name in your language. You probably grew up thinking she was just frugal, old-fashioned, a little intense about things that didn't seem to matter. But what if I told you that what you were actually watching was a nervous system that never fully came home from war? That's what we're exploring today. Not war as a political event, not war as history, but war as something that happens inside a person. Something that reshapes the brain, rewires the body, and quietly echoes through decades of ordinary life. Because the people who lived through war don't always talk about it. But if you know where to look, they show you everything. Let's start with something that might surprise you. When we think of psychological trauma from war, we tend to picture combat veterans, soldiers, fighters, people on the front lines. And yes, their experience is profound and deserves every conversation we give it. But some of the most enduring psychological effects of war belong to civilians, to the people who never held a weapon but learned to sleep with one ear open, who spent months listening for sirens, who watched their city become unrecognizable, who raised children in basements, in shelters, in the spaces between explosions. The brain doesn't distinguish between pulling a trigger and hiding from one. Threat is threat. Fear is fear. And the nervous system responds accordingly. Here's what actually happens in there. When you experience extreme, prolonged danger, your brain's threat detection system, centered in a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, essentially goes into permanent overdrive. It stops trusting that safety is real. It starts treating the present moment as a potential trap. And the body follows. Cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormones that are supposed to spike in emergencies and then settle back down, get stuck at elevated levels. Your entire physiology begins operating on a war footing, long after the war is over. This is what we now understand as complex PTSD. Not a single traumatic event, but prolonged, repeated exposure to threat that fundamentally alters how a person processes reality. And what's remarkable, and heartbreaking, is how invisible it can look from the outside. The person seems fine. They function. They've built a life. But something inside never quite exhaled. Think about this. Researchers who studied Holocaust survivors found something deeply significant, not just in the survivors themselves, but in their children and grandchildren. Something called epigenetic transmission, where extreme stress can literally alter how genes are expressed, and those alterations can be passed down biologically. One study from Mount Sinai Hospital found that children of Holocaust survivors had different cortisol profiles than comparable groups. Their stress response systems were measurably altered, even though they had never personally experienced the trauma. The war had traveled forward in time through the body itself. This is not metaphor. This is molecular biology. The past is not always past. And yet, and this is the part that never gets enough attention, people who lived through war are also some of the most psychologically complex, resilient, and philosophically rich people you will ever meet. Because what war does, among its many destructions, is strip life down to its irreducible core. It answers the question, what actually matters, in a way that no amount of comfortable living ever could. There's a concept called post-traumatic growth. And no, it's not the idea that trauma is good, or that suffering has some silver lining we should be grateful for. It's something more nuanced than that. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who developed the framework in the 1990s, found that many people who experienced severe adversity, including war, reported profound shifts in how they related to life afterward. Deeper relationships, a sharpened sense of what mattered, a different relationship with mortality that, paradoxically, made them more alive to the present. Viktor Frankl knew this intimately. He survived 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and what he observed, both in himself and in others around him, was that the people who found meaning, even in the most devastating circumstances, were the ones who maintained something the camps couldn't take: an interior life, a why. He would later write that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our freedom, our power to choose our response. A man who had every external freedom stripped from him was writing about inner freedom. That's not inspirational poster material. That's hard-won philosophy forged in absolute darkness. People who survived war often carry exactly this, a kind of philosophical ballast that the rest of us sometimes spend our whole lives searching for in books and retreats and therapy offices. They know, in their bones, that ordinary life is not ordinary, that a warm meal is not a small thing, that waking up is not guaranteed. And while that knowledge sometimes expresses itself as anxiety or hypervigilance, it also expresses itself as a ferocious gratitude that the untraumatized mind struggles to access. That grandmother saving the bread crusts? She's not being dramatic. She once knew hunger that went on long enough to rearrange her understanding of food forever. Her body remembers even when her mind has moved on. The brain regions involved in survival learning, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, they form memories differently under extreme stress. Those memories are encoded with a depth and urgency that ordinary experiences simply don't receive. They are, in a very literal neurological sense, burned in. And here's something worth sitting with. When you grow up with a parent or grandparent who survived war, you are often raised by someone whose emotional vocabulary was shaped by experiences they may never have words for. Silence in war survivors isn't absence. It's often a form of protection, of themselves and of you. Many of them made a conscious choice not to speak about what they saw, not because they forgot, but because they knew that some images, once transferred, cannot be untransferred. That silence has its own weight. Children raised in it often sense a grief they can't name, feel the presence of an absence, know that something enormous happened before them that explains the way their family holds itself. And without the words, they fill the gap with imagination, with inherited anxiety, with questions that were never supposed to be asked at the dinner table. So what do we do with all of this? How do we sit with this knowledge about the people we love, about history, about our own inherited nervous systems? I think the first thing is to replace judgment with curiosity. When someone who lived through war seems rigid or withholding or unable to receive comfort, the question isn't, why are they like this? The question is, what did they learn life required of them? Because every behavioral pattern that looks like a flaw from the outside was once a survival strategy on the inside. The detachment, the stoicism, the inability to talk about feelings, these weren't personality defects. They were armor. And armor, worn long enough, starts to feel like skin. The second thing, and this is important if you are the child or grandchild of someone who survived war, is to understand that you may be carrying emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. Not because you were broken by inheritance, but because love and trauma travel together in families, and sometimes what we feel most deeply isn't purely our own. There's something quietly liberating about that recognition. You didn't choose this weight, and with enough awareness, you can begin to set it down. And the third thing, perhaps the most universal, is to look at the war survivors in your life with the full complexity they deserve. Not as damaged people, not as heroes, but as human beings who were placed in conditions no human being should face, and who found a way to keep moving anyway. There is wisdom in that. There is something worth learning in that. Even in the bread crusts, even in the silence, even in that look across the dinner table. If someone you love lived through war, or if you are carrying the echoes of that history yourself, I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. And if this kind of deep dive into human psychology resonates with you, subscribe and stay close, because we are just getting started.